All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're sitting down with a repeat guest. His name is Dana Hicks. He's recently written a amazing book that is a must read. It's called The Quest for Thin Places: How to Find Spirituality After Deconstruction. And so, Dana, welcome back to the show, and thanks for making time for me.
Hey, Glenn, thanks for the invite. It's really great to connect again and enjoyed our conversation so much last time. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, me too. And I guess we'll just jump right in because you've been here before, so we'll skip the general intro if people want to know more about you and your background, and then go back and listen to our last conversation about marriage. We stirred the pot a little bit, which got me in some trouble, by the way.
Oh, did it?
Got
Oh,
me
that's a story.
got me some good
Yeah.
feedback
Yeah,
from
I
people.
bet.
Yeah, we kind of rocked that boat on biblical marriage a little bit, so it got some people's attention, but it was a lot of
Yeah.
fun. But anyway, this book though, you talk about deconstruction and how
Yeah.
it's not something that's linear where we start at point A and end at point Z and receive our deconstruction crown or award, but instead it's a process and it's cyclical and we go through it again and again and again. And you divide the book up wonderfully into all the different six pieces. And I was wondering if you could maybe just take us through this cycle a little bit of
Yeah.
deconstruction, maybe give us an overview of these six pieces and then how it differs from a more linear approach that people might typically think about deconstruction as.
Yeah. I think the bias I came from in the cyclical model as opposed to a linear model,
Hmm.
it is thinking about sort of the natural way that life, organic things that are, living things evolve. And, be it whether it's the seasons of the year, as we go, through the calendar, fall, winter, spring, those sorts of things, or the way, human being, kind of goes through life. There's this death, rebirth sort of cycle that's always seems to be taking place. And organic things seem to have a cycle to them.
Hmm.
Non-organic things tend to be more linear, and that's a generalization. But so thinking of deconstruction, it always just sort of annoyed me, like that people would have this sort of mindset that, yeah, I'm gonna deconstruct, and now I've got all the right answers.
That's right. I've arrived. Look at me
I've
now.
arrived, it's like, what was I thinking before? Now I've got it all figured out.
Yeah.
I think there's a certain amount of humility, I think, that comes in like, this is what I think now, but 5, 10 years from now, no doubt I'm going to look back and think it's very, I often think about how, like, um, be it the mullet I had in the 80s or whatever it might be, that my kids and grandkids someday are going to be, I mean, even like ethical sorts of things,
Yeah.
that people didn't think were a big deal in the 70s, the sexism, the misogynism, those sorts of things that everybody's kind of, boys will be boys kind of thing,
Yeah.
that we just don't put up with anymore. I think that
Mm.
things evolve, things change, and the way we think about things changes. The way we think about ourselves change over time, and so that's sort of the idea of this sort of cyclical model.
Mm.
But I have to look in the book as a cheat to remember, make sure I get these all in the right order. But the
Yeah, no
first,
worries. I could read them. I have it in front of me too. So
okay.
yeah.
So the first stage is sort of the stage you get into when you don't really want to get into it, whether you like it or not. It's
Right.
the deconstruction stage, and we find ourselves in a situation where what worked in the past is not working now.
Yeah.
And it's the proverbial it works till it doesn't work kind of thing, and then you can only deny reality so long or pretend, do mental gymnastics for so long until you realize that this is absurd and unsustainable.
Yeah.
And then you find yourself in a liminal space, and we can talk about that, kind of between two things. Our minds hate being indecisive and not knowing. And so it's a painful sort of, mentally painful sort of place to be, that in
Yeah.
between stage.
Hmm.
But that if we're smart, that leads us to sort of clarify, and that's the next step. Clarify what it is that we really want, and as the Buddhists talk about, it would begin to think of our lives with a beginner's mind, seeing it in a fresh way and thinking about it in a new way. And what is it that we really want? We think we want some, certainty, and confidence and those sorts of things, but underneath it all, that's really, really not what we want. The
Hmm.
thing beneath the thing beneath the thing. What is it that's really going to satisfy our souls, not just give us a short-term fix? And we end up chasing, it as we try to find certainty, as we try to find stability after deconstruction, we often chase lots of shadowy things,
Yeah.
trying to find a place for that in religion and religious systems or people and whatnot.
Mhm.
And so asking that question, being reflective enough to think of what is it that I really want? What's the thing beneath the thing that's going to satisfy me?
Mhm.
And then the next stage is the removal stage, which I think is one of the most critical things that we miss, especially in a consumeristic society like we live in. We think more is more.
Mhm.
But in the spiritual world, traditionally less is more. The more we can remove of the artificial things around us, becoming unbecoming what we're not, is sort of this idea of removal,
Mhm.
that we pick up things along the way that aren't really us, that we don't really think, that we adopt from others to make them happy. And so getting rid of those sorts of things brings a lot of freedom. And it's sort of one of the big secrets of spirituality of the mystics throughout the centuries, this
Mhm.
unbecoming of who we are. I like to think of it like Marie Kondo from that TV show, taking those things,
That's
looking at
right.
it. You served me for a season. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Goodbye,
Yeah.
and you get rid of it. And so removing those sorts of things. The next stage is what I call the quest stage, which I think is in many ways the most difficult stage in terms of it takes a certain amount of courage to begin to ask some questions. It takes a
Mhm.
lot of courage to begin to feel emotions that we don't want to feel, uncomfortable emotions and difficult emotions. But once we learn to lean into those things, we it opens the door for a lot of possibilities and experiences that we wouldn't otherwise be able to have.
Mhm.
And that leads us to the reconstruction stage. And again, this isn't a like, okay, now I've got it figured out, it's all done, but
Right.
it's a like, how do I what do I begin to add now in terms of where we're at. And so I talk a lot in this section about brain science
Mhm.
and what brain scientists call the default mode network, and how that's really tied to a spirituality in a lot of ways, and
Mhm.
sort of the physical mechanics of that, and how meditation plays into that. When we silence this default mode network in our mind, what happens? And what happens when we really silence the default mode network in our mind?
Mhm.
How that sort of transforms us, and it leads to the section that maybe in the marriage book that was plenty of controversy, but the controversy in this book is leading to my experiences with psilocybin and magic mushrooms, and
Mhm.
how that played um, into my own experiences of shutting down the default mode network and having these experiences of awe and wonder and transcendence that we really are looking for.
Mhm.
So reconstruction is just, I kind of talk about some of my own journey in that, and
Mhm.
like, again, it's not prescriptive of like therefore you must,
Right.
do mushrooms or whatever, but it's
Right.
just an example of like the way we can begin to reconstruct and searching for these experiences of awe, wonder, and beauty and
Mhm.
transcendence and those sorts of things. And then the last section is just sort of the preacher part of me, from my 30 years of being a pastor, of like, how do we make this practical? How do we create systems in our life to and processes in our life that we can cultivate these sorts of things in our lives,
Mhm.
over and over again, so that we can continue this process. We don't find ourselves stuck in the, okay, I've arrived and now I'm going to be judgmental about everybody else who isn't, where I'm at, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that, early on you talked about that liminal space
Mm,
and like coming, that's one of the things that I struggled with a lot in the beginning was coming out of that evangelical world where all of your T's are crossed and all of your I's are dotted and you have your systematic theologies and you have your verse for every piece of theology and all this kind of stuff. Like everything was very neat and categorized in my head,
right.
and having gone through Bible college and gone through seminary and really studied even like how do you teach these things to other people? Like everything was just very systematized in my head. And I can remember, having that moment of what has always worked isn't working anymore. And that for me
Mm-hmm.
came when
Mm-hmm.
our daughter was born and she was rushed to the NICU. And it was just
Mm,
having this moment with her where she first reached out and touched my finger. and like everything just exploded for me, like, original sin and, substitutionary atonement. Like here's I am a brand new father in the NICU, literally thinking about all of this stuff. And I was like, man, this just doesn't make any sense in light of my current and new experience. And like
Yeah.
I have an option where I can push back on what I'm feeling, and I can just go with what I've mentally categorized in my head and just say I'm going to have enough faith to keep believing it, or I can let myself go down this rabbit hole of exploring these feelings and see where it's going to end up. And there was a lot of time in that liminal space where I felt like I didn't know what to do. And that was a very difficult feeling to wrestle with coming from my background, because I can remember going on Twitter at the time, and Brian McLaren was like super active on Twitter, and
Hmm.
reaching out to him and asking him like, well, what do I do with this verse? Like if I don't believe this anymore, what about this and what about that? And he was so kind and going back and forth, and finally he said, you know what, like you're going to get to a place where you're just going to have to embrace the mystery of it
Hmm.
all. And I was like,
Hmm.
man, I don't know if I'm ever going to get to that place, Brian. But here I am, all these years later, and I'm much more comfortable in that space than I used to
Yeah.
be. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And that's huge growth, isn't it? I mean, and I think about, a lot of the friends and family that I have that are in still in that evangelical world, that if you question one piece of it, like the whole thing comes tumbling down, right?
yeah.
And you don't believe in 7-day creation? Well, then Jesus wasn't real, I mean, it's like I don't, and for them it's a system, right? And
That's
so
right.
when and Rob Bell talks about this, I mean, he talked about this years ago in his first book in Velvet Elvis, talking
Mm,
about how if we view faith as a like a wall, a brick
yep.
wall, then we have to defend it at all costs, because one pull out one brick, the whole thing collapse, as
Yep.
opposed to viewing it like a web
Yep.
that's sort of loose and has a million different points. And that was really helpful to me back in the day too, to sort of think, okay, I don't have to buy everything.
That's
I
right.
can I can I can pull out some of these pieces without losing the entire thing. But then so many of us do experience the crashing down of the Jenga pieces, and into a million things, and wondering, "Hey, will we ever put this thing back together?" I mean,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
and it's a scary place to be,
Yep.
for sure.
Yeah. And sometimes, you need to, I mean, what I found in my own journey was there was points, and there still are points in the journey where I feel like I have to distance myself from all of it. Like
Hmm.
I put my Bible away for a long time because I just couldn't read it
Hmm.
apart from the narrative that I was given. And it was just too much for me to grapple with. So there was a good 6 months to a year. I just didn't even open it. And then,
Yeah.
for me, coming from my background, that was a no-no because you did your morning devotions every day and
Right.
you read it every day.
Right.
So I had like a lot of anxiety about, is God going to be mad at me? But then that brought me down another rabbit hole of, God's anger and, what makes God angry and is God angry and all those kind of things. And it's just, I think to the point is sometimes you just have to separate yourself from everything just to have some breathing room.
Yeah, for sure. For
Yeah.
sure.
So there's two parts of the cycle that really struck me, and I would love if we could talk a little bit more
Yeah.
about them. But the first one is part two, which is clarify, and
Hmm.
about realizing that what you think you want isn't actually the thing that you actually want or maybe even need. And so the challenge there, like you said, is to kind of clarify what it is that you're really after on the spiritual journey. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk to us a little bit more about what it means to clarify in the context of deconstruction, and what does that look like for you, like in your journey? What are some different things that you've had to clarify?
Yeah. Man, it's such a broad question. I'm just trying to narrow it down in my head. Because there's so many thoughts I have.
Go whatever way you
Actually,
want.
I think the my thought process on this whole section came years ago. I was a youth pastor
Mhm.
in the late 80s, back in a small town in Idaho. And we took the kids. I don't Some of your listeners may remember Josh McDowell, who
Yep.
used to go
Oh
out,
yeah.
and
Evidence that
he
demands a verdict.
evidence that demands a verdict,
Yeah.
exactly. But for a season, he was really into giving sex talks to teenagers,
Hmm.
talking about how important it is to not have sex. And so I took him to this talk that Josh McDowell was giving, and during the talk, he says to the kids, he says, "I know what you kids really want. Uh, you don't really want sex, you know." And of course, the kids are like, "Rah, rah, 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 rah," you know, kind of thing. And he says, "No, no, no, that's not what you really want. What you really want is intimacy." And sort of the stunned silence came over the crowd. And I think to Josh McDowell's credit, I think that he was partly right on that. But I do know some teenagers that really do want sex, not
Right.
intimacy. But but it got me to thinking that there's a way of thinking about the desires that we have in our life that I think for most functioning human beings, really what they want is not sexuality, but they want what sexuality brings, which is intimacy and closeness
Mhm.
and connection with another human. Uh, and so what is it, the thing beneath the thing? I began to realize that sort of planted a seed in my head to think about often what we think we want is not what we really want.
Mhm.
Even when it comes to things like, I want money. But is it really money that I want, or is it that I want security? Or that I want to be able to tell my boss to go stick it, whenever I feel like it, I
Yeah.
have the freedom to do those things,
Mm.
you know it's not really money that I want. It's the things that money brings that I want, or, there's a million examples of that. And so what's the thing beneath the thing that we really want? And
Mm.
so sort of taking a minute to ask those questions of why is it that we want this? Why? And I talk in the book about the Toyota Corporation developing the nine whys, asking this question constantly of, why are we doing this? Why? What's
Mm.
causing this? And when we get to the bottom of it, what we end up finding is that human beings are intensely motivated and driven by this sense of awe and wonder and transcendence that takes us to other places, that makes us feel both big and small at the same time.
Yeah.
And and when we have those sorts of experiences, they can be very transformative for us, and they can really shape the way we see ourselves in the world and the way we interact in the world. And I think
Mm.
I think the deepest desire of the human soul is exactly that. And so in that clarify section, I'm trying to point the readers to say, you think you really want certainty, but you don't. You think you really want confidence, but that's not really what you want. You want something bigger than that.
Yeah.
And you're selling yourself short if you settle for those other things.
That's right.
You want an experience with the divine is really what you want,
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
encounter with the divine.
Yeah. I mean, that's so good. And I mean, these thoughts for me are very fresh. I feel like I'm in another cycle of deconstruction these days. I feel like I'm going down another layer of the onion. But been thinking a
Yeah,
lot about after, especially after I read your book, when I stood on the right, as a fundamentalist evangelical, and then when I stood on the left as a more progressive thinking Christian, in both places, like I thought I was after a sense of certainty and a sense of like morality, right? Like
hmm,
I want to do what God wants me to do. I want to be the kind of person that God wants me to be. I want to be just like I think, the people on my side thinks that Jesus was. And the problem though was I came to realize is that on both sides, I was carrying like the same kind of energy, just
mm,
as angry, just as judgmental of the other side, just as shaming as the other side. So on the right, I would shame Obama supporters. On the left, I shamed Trump supporters. And it's the same energy. And what I
yeah,
thought was the same desire to be moral, to be more like Jesus, and the same arguments about how bad and immoral they are, over there. But then I got to thinking like, it was like in the middle of the election season when things were
hmm,
really heating up. I was thinking, is this like really what I'm after? Like, am I just trying
hmm,
to be more Jesus-like, or what my side thinks Jesus is like, or is there more to that, like you said? And so today, I'm in this place where I feel like I'm trying to dig deeper into what I'm really after. And much to the dislike of my more progressive friends, I don't really identify myself anymore with any kind of label like a progressive thinking Christian or an evangelical Christian or whatever. But I feel like I'm after that experience with God where I'm trying to see God in all people and
Mm,
all things
hmm.
with no limits. And so rather than the journey with Christ taking me to the left or taking me to the right or whatever, I feel like that journey is taking me inside, where I'm
Mm,
learning to hear my own intuitive voice and
hmm.
follow that wherever it may lead. And so I feel like that for me has been a huge point of clarification, is really
Yeah.
trying to realize that for so long I've shut down that intuitive voice because I was taught all my life the heart is deceitful above all things. You can't listen to that inner voice. And
Right.
now I notice it's still in there as much as I've tried to shut it up. And so now I feel like I'm trying to discern what that is and dig deeper into it. And that's been a big clarification point for me.
Yeah, and what a great way to manipulate groups of people by telling them that they can't trust their heart,
That's right.
you know? I mean, it's the proverbial, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain kind of thing, It's
Yep.
like there's a that's yeah, I don't even throw a rabbit trail on that, but man, I can really identify with what you're saying, and that's been part of my experience too, is trying to I was part of a very conservative evangelical denomination, and I had had enough of them, and I left it, and I went to a mainline denomination that was really progressive, and I thought this is going to be the answer to all my problems,
Yep.
all these people have it figured out, and I found out there's just as much fundamentalism and that same attitude. It just changed out the pieces of what, we're better than them because
Yep.
of this,
That's
kind of
right.
thing. And we're right and they're wrong, and this sense of superiority and arrogance. And I was just, yeah, it blew my mind. There's no shortage of it, I guess, in all of humanity,
Yep.
that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I
So,
had somebody on the show a while ago and she phrased it really well. She said it was almost, she had a similar experience. That it was almost like I was becoming the very thing I was trying to leave behind. Like I was trying to leave behind this way of thinking, this way of holding my opinions. And I felt myself becoming something different. But then very quickly, I noticed that in that, on the left, there was just as many gatekeepers and just as many, you know,
right.
this is the way you have to believe. If you don't believe this, like there's so many people nowadays where it's like if you don't believe this or you support this person, like you're not a real Christian. And it's like that's the same mindset
It's
and
the
the
same
same
language. It's
phrases,
the
the
same.
same language I
Yeah,
used to
you're
use.
just and I've seen that so many times, and I think I talk about this in the introduction of the book. I've seen that so many times with people that deconstruct. It's like they get rid of one unhealthy set of beliefs and then they just adopt another. And
Yep.
they act like fundamentalists over a different set of beliefs.
Yep.
And so the core of who they are and what they're really looking for hasn't changed, They're still trying this sense of superiority and belief that drove them as a evangelical.
That's right. So the other part of the cycle that really stuck out at me is the whole idea of removal. And
Mm,
you brought this up before that, in our westernized, Americanized culture, we tend to think that progress is all about addition, right? We need like more
hmm.
technology, we need better this, we need more classes, more books, more knowledge, more things, and the more that we have, the better off we are. But this idea that a deeper spirituality is more about removing things that maybe aren't necessary or don't serve us anymore. So I'm wondering, similar to the last point, like if you could maybe take us into your story a little bit more of your experience with removal. Like what are some things in your spiritual journey that once served you well and that maybe they're not like bad things. It's not like they were, they're horrible things, but now you're at this place in your journey where you realize, you know what, that doesn't serve me anymore. So cutting it out or removing it has actually helped to foster your growth as opposed to hinder it.
Yeah, and again, I think of it in a Marie Kondo kind of way that
Mhm.
I don't sit in judgment of things in the past. A lot of what's happened to me in my own journey in the past was helpful at the time,
Hmm.
but and like as an adolescent or even as a child, I mean, there were things, structures, and things that my parents taught me that kept me from a lot of pain and a
Yep.
lot of stupid decisions. And but as Paul in the New Testament says, when I was a child I thought like a child and I reasoned like a child, but when I became an adult I put that stuff away.
Mhm.
And so there comes a point where sort of we get rid of those sorts of things. We remove those things, those childish beliefs that we have, and the way we think the world works, and this sort of real simple sense of uh you know punishment, I guess, is the big thing, right? We talk about with morality with kids. It's pretty simple. We say, uh, don't do that, or I'm going to slap your hand, or
Hmm.
there's going to be a physical consequence, or whatever it might be. And so morality for a kid is very simple. It's black and white. It's these actions are bad, these actions are good. And I think, and again, to talk about my in context of my own journey, I mean, that was the way I grew up, and it was helpful at the time. But at some point, you have to grow beyond that to begin to see your sense of morality is something bigger than that. And so yeah, there's been a lot of things, even on down to the way, it was interesting, Glenn, when you were talking about, your sense of identity, and who you identify as, as a conservative, or as a liberal, or whatever it might be. Even I think, even after some of my experiences in Mexico that I talk about in the book, I began to sort of see myself like those sorts of labels just aren't helpful. I mean, in
Hmm.
terms of like, they're helpful to other people to pigeonhole me,
Yeah.
but in terms of who I want to be and what I'm pursuing, it those sorts of things aren't helpful any longer to me. So when people ask me, and I had somebody ask me recently, well, do you identify as a Christian then? And I and I'm like, well, I don't know. How do you define
It's a
Christian?
loaded term. Yeah. What are you asking?
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot of ways to define this, and of course they
Right.
defined it in a very, conservative, Jesus died a torturous death for you, you miserable, do you believe that?
Wretch.
And I'm like,
Right.
exactly. And I was like, I don't think I really believe that, but I like Jesus,
Right.
so I think he's a pretty good dude. He's a pretty smart dude, so they don't know what to do with that. And that's okay. It's more for their comfort than for mine.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm fine with where I'm at. So I think that, yeah, I had interpersonal things that fell apart in my life that sort of led to, a big cycle of deconstruction for me.
Mhm.
And then uh I walked away from pastoral ministry. I walked away from the church. I walked away from a lot of things. I moved to a different town. And it really gave me a lot of freedom. I know most people don't have this kind of freedom because they deconstruct within the context of their
Mhm.
community. But I walked into a new community that really didn't care that I'd been a pastor. And so
Mhm.
that gave me a lot more freedom to remove those sorts of things. I think those of us that have been in the clergy, it becomes such a stifling straitjacket
Yep.
of it forces us to say things that are the company line, and to try to defend things that are indefensible, and doesn't give us a lot of freedom to ask some deeper questions a lot of
Okay.
times. And
Mhm.
so when my paycheck quit coming from a Christian institution, it really allowed it, like accelerated my deconstruction process, because it's like, okay, I no longer have to like fall within a certain
You don't have to
category.
rein it in anymore. Yeah.
Exactly. We're worried about whether I'll get defrocked if I say this or do this or whatever, so
Yeah.
um
Yeah. I feel like for me, like one of the big removal pieces has been like needing Jesus to agree with me, because like I felt like that was always like my litmus test of whether I was on the right track was how many verses or how many passages of scripture can I find Jesus doing something or saying something that aligns with the current way that I'm thinking?
hmm
And
hmm
in this new space that I'm in, kind of trying to strip away all those different labels, I was reading in the Gospels a few weeks ago and I was, kind of meditating on different things. And I just had this like distinct thought in my head, whether it was Christ or God or the universe, whatever, just like, how about you just let me be me and you be you and see where that takes you? And I was like, yeah, like I feel like that's what I'm after, is not trying to commandeer Jesus to, be on my side, but just to observe the way that Jesus spoke and acted,
Hmm.
and then listen to that voice inside and see where it may lead me. And what I'm finding is that you and I could both listen to our internal voice, our internal GPS of the heart, so to speak,
Hmm.
and maybe even land in two different places. That doesn't mean that one of us is necessarily right, one of us is wrong. It might just be, I think, that, you know, our intuition is leading us to respond and to act in our part of the world in a particular way. And what
Hmm.
if we could come together, you and I, arm in arm, even if we don't see eye to eye, to make the world a better place in our own unique ways? And like, what if that's more of the way, as opposed to having to have everybody think like me, act like me, believe like me, so that we can all do the same mission? Like, what if it's that diversity in thought that really is what can ultimately bring us together? And that's just kind of the thing I'm wrestling with now. But again, just kind of removing that need to have
Yeah.
Jesus fit and look like me and have everybody else fit and look like me as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I can relate to that a lot. In my journey, I'd frame it a little bit different. I think I've gone from trying to have Jesus bless everything that I'm doing, or co-sign on everything I'm doing, and instead now I'm trying to find what he's doing and recognize that.
Hmm.
I think that's much more interesting.
Yep.
uh Having the eyes to see the divine at work in the world in places that you wouldn't normally expect it. Like so many things, it's like uh there's so much out there that we just don't pay attention to
Yep.
because we don't have eyes to see, seems like Jesus may have said something about that, about eyes to see. Yeah.
Yep.
The ability to see that God at work, and this was again used in the New Testament. This is a lot of the conflict of the New Testament, is people's inability to see God at work in a particular situation, which really is Jesus' definition of blasphemy. Is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit is
Mm-hmm.
to say, that's not God at work in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that's the interesting question. Like finding God in the homeless guy, finding God in the hospital among the suffering, finding God, as I'm folding the laundry or putting the kids to bed or changing a diaper or doing the dishes, or in those mundane sorts of things that that the divine is there. We just don't have the eyes to see it a lot of times,
Yeah.
and it is the awareness of that. And so when we stop asking, it's just a different set of questions and a different way of seeing it. Like, I'm doing something right and I want God to endorse it, as opposed to God is doing something and I want to recognize it and get on board with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was talking to Bruce Epperly, Bruce. I'm
Oh
sure he
yeah,
was
yeah.
on the podcast a couple days ago, and we were talking about the similar kind of thing, and we were talking about the political arena, and obviously Donald Trump is the president again, and he said, it's like, what does it look like? He said, I'm trying to formulate my prayers where I pray for Donald Trump to succeed. Not necessarily to succeed in the things that he wants to succeed in, because is that really necessarily the best thing for the world? He said, are the things that I want to succeed in necessarily the best thing for the world? But he said, trying to recognize the fact that if God is in everybody, that means that God is also in the people that we don't like and we don't agree with. And so, can I formulate my prayers in a way where, I pray that Donald Trump, I pray that whatever leaders that I don't like or I don't agree with, that they're able to see the divine at work in their life and they're able to have a revelatory moment where, even if they're not going to alter the entire way that they live their life, can they have a revelatory moment where they see the divine working and they actively choose to follow that way?
Mm.
And he said, like, am I not supposed to pray for the person? Am I not supposed to have those hopes for the person? And again, like for me, like that's also a very radical way to think. And it's forced me to remove other aspects of my faith because again, growing up in the evangelical circle and then going over to the progressive circle, you know, you struggle to pray for the
Mm,
leader that you didn't like. And for
hmm
me,
hmm
I've had to really remove that now, and I have to really think about what does it look like for me to really wish the best, hope the best, and pray the best, you know, for a particular person, even if some of the things that they believe and do might I might consider harmful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff. Yeah, I've really I probably like 60% of Americans. I've lost some sleep over these last few weeks of the second term of
Yep.
Trump presidency, and it, it's it's been it's stressful, and it's difficult. I feel fortunate. I'm a white middle class male, and most of what takes place isn't going to have much effect on me, but it's not about me,
Hmm.
it's about others. But I think in the book I talk a lot. One of the things that's been helpful to me, is in the Buddhist tradition, there's this idea that there are there are stories that we tell about the world, and the stories that we tell sometimes cause a lot of suffering because we believe those things to be true when in fact they're just representations of other things. And so let me try to back this up a little bit. So in in Alcoholics Anonymous tradition, there's
Hmm.
this idea that alcoholism is one of the roots of alcoholism is our unhealthy attempts at trying to control our world and our universe, and that when we try to control things that we can't control, it creates a neurosis in our minds, and that leads to addiction and whatnot. So that's sort of the foundation of it. And so in the Alcoholics Anonymous tradition, they end their 12-step groups with the Serenity Prayer, and it's a longer prayer written by Reinhold Niebuhr, but the prayer is, most people recognize, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Um, that prayer is one that I've been saying quite a bit in recent days.
Hmm.
That I'm not in Congress, and I'm not in the Senate, and I am not a judge, a federal judge. And so I'm pretty limited in terms of what I can change about these situations. Um, and that doesn't mean when we accept the things we can't change, that doesn't mean we like them. That just means we quit fighting against them in the Buddhist tradition.
Hmm.
We quit fighting against those things because we're fighting against things that we can't win.
Yeah.
And so we're exerting lots of energy on those sorts of things. Now, there are things I can change. I can change the way I vote. I can call my representatives. I mean, there's things that I can do. Um, it's not like I'm completely helpless.
Hmm.
But again, the wisdom to know the difference is the thing, the third line, right?
Yeah.
And it does take a lot of wisdom sometimes to know, right? How much control do I have here? Uh, and so my ability to step back and say, I have to accept this. I don't have to like it, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
And this is what it's going to be. And it's going to suck for a lot of people, for a lot of people. And mostly people that are marginalized, frankly.
Yeah.
And it's frankly evil, but I can't change that. I can't change the vast majority of it.
Yeah.
Um, I can control, I can help my people that are in my circle, the people that are affected by those things, but on a federal level, I mean, my hands are pretty tied. I'm just some dude who lives in Phoenix.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, it was a lot of that came to light for me when because my daughter's 7, and so she's in second grade. And during the election season, she would come home multiple times. And I remember one day she said, so and so said that they hate uh, Donald Trump, and that if Donald Trump wins, all these bad things are going to happen. And then it was like a week later, she came home and said, well, this other person in my class said that they hate Kamala Harris. And that if Kamala Harris wins, all these bad things are going to happen. And she was having, you could see having this like
Right.
crisis in her head of like, this friend, Johnny, says they hate this person and Mary hates this person. And if the person that they like wins, bad things are going to happen. And she was just so confused. And I said to her, I said, first of all, I said, they're seven. I said, they don't hate any of those people. I said, they've heard their moms and dads probably say that, or their grandparents, their aunts, uncles, whatever. I said, so that's the first thing to know. And I said, secondly, I said, when people get behind a particular candidate, sometimes there is a lot of fear surrounding what's going to happen if the other person wins. And I said, because fear can get people to do a lot of things. I said, so whatever candidate, whatever person's running for president, they're going to try to make people afraid of the other person. I said, whether those fears are legitimate or they're not legitimate, I said, they're going to try to make you as afraid as they can because it gets you to vote, for them. And
Hmm.
I said, at the end of the day, one of them is going to win. I said, there's other people that run. I said, but it's not going to be one of them. I said, one of those two are going to win. And I said, but, I said, let's just say, it's Donald Trump that wins. And I said, let's just say that we don't want Donald Trump to win. I said that we still have neighbors down the street who have Donald Trump flags on their house. So I said, like, for the next 4 years, are we just not going to talk to those people? Are we just going to avoid those people? Are we just going to be angry at those people? I said, or are we going to try to accept whatever is going to be and live forward in our community and carry ourselves through life in a way that's going to be honoring, to God and honoring to the people around us. I said, I feel like we can't control what happens in the White House. We have very little control over what happens in those things. As much as people want to think they have control, we have very little control. I said, but what we do have control is how we're going to live our life tomorrow and the day after that. And I said, I think that for you, I think that for me, I said those are the big things that we have to think about is when somebody comes to school and they say they hate this person, they hate that person. I said, how are we going to respond to that? Are we going to jump on the hate train and say how much we hate things as well? Or are we going to maybe try to carry ourselves in a different way? And so I feel like that gave her a lot of things to think about and gave me a lot of things to think about too, because I feel like having a child has really helped me wrestle with what do I really think about these things? And what
Yeah.
kind of child do I want to send out into the world in the midst of this climate that we're in?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of a woo-woo way to think about it, but I think that there's something to, a lot of New Agers talk about like being uh on the energetic level of somebody. And I find myself in that too. Like when when a political leader, let's just say a political leader,
Mhm.
acts like a petulant toddler, you know, and my temptation is to respond in kind, right? And to go to that wavelength and to say, yeah, well, I'm going to throw a temper tantrum too, kind of
Mhm.
thing.
Yeah.
Uh, and I have to consciously catch myself. I am always catching myself to say, I don't want to be on this energetic level with him
Yeah.
or this hypothetical leader.
Yep.
Uh, and I think it's really easy to and I have so many friends, the coworkers that, and I work in the nonprofit world, and the nonprofit world is melting down these
Mhm.
days over all that's going on.
Yeah.
And I'm trying so hard to, again, this is not, God grant me this or anything except the things I cannot
Right.
change.
Right.
The wisdom to know the difference, the
Yep.
courage to change things I can. And it's a lot easier said than done, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. That's right. All right, last question for you. What's your advice for somebody who's listening who, in the book you use the reference of the Jenga tower and you pull
Mhm.
out one block and it's all right, but you start pulling out more blocks and it teeters and eventually the whole thing collapses. What's your advice for the person who maybe this is their first entrance into deconstruction, or maybe like us, they've been through multiple rounds of things and they find themselves
Yeah.
approaching yet another layer of the onion. What's your advice for somebody who's in that space where maybe it's that liminal space where they just don't know what in the world they believe about. Maybe it's a particular piece of theology. Maybe it's about their politics. Maybe it's just about how to move forward in the world in this time. We're at another presidential term and it's another 4 years. And am I going to move through it the same way I did the last time? Am I going to move through it differently? Like, what's your advice for that
Yeah.
person who's trying to wrestle with those kinds of questions?
Yeah, in that deconstruction phase, that liminal space that you're talking about, Glenn, I think, it starts as an intellectual exercise for most people, I
Mhm.
think, but ends up being an emotional experience. And so it's really the courage to lean into that emotional discomfort
Yeah.
that that allows us to move forward. I mean, the whole rhythm of Christian spirituality is death and resurrection,
Mhm.
right? Death and resurrection, death and resurrection. We die and are born into something new. We die and we're born into something new. And so this cycle shouldn't be sound unfamiliar to those of us who are have been part of that Christian tradition.
That's right.
I mean, it's death and resurrection. That's all it is.
Mhm.
And my friend Jonathan Foster frames it in a way that I really like. He says, endings are beginnings.
Yep.
Endings are beginnings. And once you recognize that what is coming to an end just means that something else new is being born. And if we can have the faith to believe that the butterfly is coming out of the cocoon on this, that and that's hard. That's a lot easier said than done again,
Mhm.
because again, it's an emotional thing.
Right.
Uh it's deconstruction takes an emotional courage more than sometimes an intellectual courage to face these things. And um, for listeners who maybe are in the middle of this or just feeling the beginnings of it, and it's absolutely frightening to look over the abyss and say, if I take this step, is there anything to catch me
Right.
down there? Or I fall forever.
Yeah.
And it's a very real, I mean, very real thing. And I guess what I would try to encourage them to say is, I know I don't have any evidence to show you, but there's something there.
Yeah.
There's going to be something there, and it
Yeah.
may not come the next day, there'll be something there, and you'll find yourself in a better place.
That's right.
In that.
Yeah. And I think too, it's like just embracing the freedom to change, right? I mean,
Mm,
how many of us grew up in that place where, if you change your mind on your theology or you're going astray and the whole thing is gonna fall apart, but giving yourself that permission to evolve and to
yeah,
grow. And like you said, the death of Christ was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning of eternity. It was just the beginning of something new. And that, if we can allow ourselves to see that, how much freedom there is in that. And I was talking again to my daughter a couple nights ago. We were laying in bed and she asked me questions about God and what I used to do when I was a pastor and stuff. And I said to her, I said, no. She said, well, what did you used to believe? Did you always believe the same things? I said, no. I said, I used to believe we've talked about hell, we've talked about the rapture, and she's like, "You used to believe that? That's crazy stuff," And I said, "Yeah," and I said, "But I said the coolest thing is, I said, is that I said, look at how much in a short period of time I've grown and I've changed." And I said, "There's
mm,
always freedom to change your mind." And I said,
yeah,
someday you're gonna grow and you're gonna have different experiences in your life." And I said, "You're gonna change your mind about things." I said, "You might come across somebody who has a different idea than you, and you might say that you don't want to change your mind on that particular thing because you feel very strongly about yourself." I said, "But there's a lot of freedom to change your mind." And I said, "I think that's one of the beautiful things about having faith is that it's always growing and changing and evolving as you have more and more experiences." So,
yeah, sure.
yeah.
And one last thought on that too.
Hmm.
As you're talking, I was thinking about this, how um, you know, for your listeners who still identify with Jesus, still
Hmm.
call themselves Christians or whatever, I think Jesus himself was the ultimate deconstructor. 7 times in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you."
Yeah.
He's just deconstructing all over the place. He's constantly pushing humans to think, yeah, you thought you had it figured out. You thought you knew what this all meant, but let me push you on that,
Yeah.
and help you refine this. He does this all the time. So he gives us permission to say, I have heard it said, but now I say
That's right. That's
over
right.
and over and over and over
That's
again.
it. Make it your mantra, right?
Yeah,
That's right.
exactly.
That's right.
Exactly.
Well, Dana, this has been a lot of fun. I
Oh
appreciate you
yeah.
taking time for me and for our listeners. Real quick, is there any way you want to direct us to online? Any websites? Any virtual
Yeah,
material
I
out
kind
there?
of play around. My website, danahicks.blog, is where I keep some stuff, some essays I wrote and things like that, things that I'm kind of working on. If listeners want to go there, and my stuff's all on Amazon um, and Audible. So
Awesome.
um, yeah,
Great. Well, I'll put the links in the show notes and we'll do it again.
great. Sounds great. Thanks so much, Glenn.
Thank
Appreciate it.
you.